Hi everyone, today we're going to be taking on something a little theoretical and pretty broad. By the end of this video, I'm hoping you'll all have a general idea of the traditional arguments about the history of empires, what drove them to expand, particularly in the 19th century. I also hope you'll have a basic knowledge of the history of the Japanese Empire that you can build on with some further reading. If you don't have them already, now would be a good time to pause and grab a pen and paper. If you find any of this interesting, it would be a good idea to write it down to supplement your current studying. And here briefly are the goals for this session. To introduce and understand historical theories about imperialism, to gain a basic understanding of the history of the Japanese Empire, to discuss the possible difficulties and problems when applying historical theory. Before we begin though, what do we mean when we say historical theory? Beyond just discerning the facts, it is the job of historians to turn those facts into explanations. These explanations are theories, ideas about events in the past and why they happened. Theories can apply anywhere from the very specific to the very broad, though often when theories expand too far, they start to stray from the facts, and this is something we'll be noticing today. A question you may want to ponder after the video: is it even possible to do history without theory? Or are we always going to bring certain assumptions to the past whether we acknowledge them or not? And what do we mean by imperialism? Imperialism is a pretty broad idea appearing in different forms throughout almost all of human history. For our purposes, this general definition from Carl Hodge meets our needs: the extension of the dominion of one nation over others by military conquest, political or economic compulsion, or some combination of the three. It is important to note that almost all the theories we'll be examining today apply specifically to the 19th and 20th century, though that's not to say you couldn't apply them to earlier or later periods. So what general background about the history of Japan do we need before we can introduce some theories? Significant here is that Japan had very little state-level political engagement with the rest of Asia beyond Korea and sometimes China. Prior to the 19th century, that is. Some of you may have heard of the Imjin War, starting in 1592, when Shogun Toyotomi Hideyoshi launched an invasion of Korea, but was repelled by Chinese and Korean troops. This was an exceptional event, however, as proved by the 200 years of internal and external peace under the Tokugawa shogunate that followed. This peace was rudely shattered by the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry and his American naval squadron in 1854 that forced Japan to open its ports to Western trade, which had previously been limited to a Dutch enclave. What followed was the political disintegration of the Tokugawa, overthrown in a civil war by Choshu and Satsuma, domains at the southern tip of Japan. In 1864, the samurai of those domains proclaimed the restoration of the emperor to formal political power and began a radical program of political and economic reform known as the Meiji Restoration. Previously, the emperor had been a figurehead, sidelined by the more powerful shogun. This marked the beginning of Japan's growth as a modern nation, the start of processes that led them to empire. But we'll return to that history once we've established some of our theories. The first category of theories we want to look at is the economic, and I've distinguished these from the Marxists just for the sake of clarity. I'll get on to why shortly. Hobson is one of the first and most famous writers to tackle imperialism. His argument is essentially that imperialism stems from the desire amongst wealthy producers for profits not available at home. Essentially, capitalism had concentrated wealth in the hands of a few, leaving the majority of people unable to buy the goods they produced. The solution was to look for markets overseas. Weber had a similar thesis. Imperialism was the result of monopoly capitalism, a distortion of the market that strengthened its grip by bringing in resources from overseas. And what distinguishes these ideas from Marxism? Well, both these theories attempt to define imperialism as the failure of market mechanisms, a distortion of capitalism, which is normally good, as opposed to a Marxist who would argue that capitalism naturally produces these bad outcomes without distortions. As we go through each theory, by the way, it might be wise to pause the video for a couple of minutes and consider if and how these theories might apply to the periods you currently study at school. The second major category is the social. This is a very general designation, but generally refers to theories that see economic causes as secondary. They noted that economics doesn't always stack up in the way that earlier theories have predicted and look to expand the range of possible causes. Economics was only one cause in a whole lattice of interweaving causation. Schumpeter was an Austrian economist writing after World War I. His analysis was naturally inspired by the violence seen across Europe. For him, imperialism was antithetical to modernity and was a legacy from the militaristic ambition of a warrior elite that still held power in Europe. He saw this warrior class stemming initially from the need for defense, but eventually losing its place and having to engineer conflict to validate its existence. This was expanded upon by Winslow and Rostow, who also saw imperialism as a psychological relic of feudalism. Sulzbach linked this survival to nationalism, which he saw as a barbaric inheritance of less enlightened times. What all these theories have in common is their timing. They followed a violent explosion of nationalism around World War I, and they naturally chose to revolt against it. These theories are optimistic, however. Is nationalism and imperialism really a relic of a feudal past, or the product of modern economies and modern militaries? Though fun to think about, can we ever define this coherent warrior class that Schumpeter talks about, who always gain from conflict? Surely, they're not going to be coherent as we study history. Feel free to pause the video here and again think about these before we move on. So, Marxist theories are, again, naturally economic in nature and build upon the economic theories we discussed a moment ago. What distinguishes them, though, is their guiding ideology. They seek to fit the expansion of 19th century empires into a Marxist view of history in which capitalism destroys itself and is replaced by communism. Rosa Luxemburg, also known for leading the Spartacist socialist uprising in Weimar Germany, saw imperialism as a requirement of capitalism. Similarly to Hobson, she believed the West needed new territories, new labour, and new resources to drive its constant growth. Lenin, also known for the Russian Revolution, built on this, arguing that imperialism allowed for continual growth that kept living standards in the West high enough to prevent a revolt there from the proletariat. This, Lenin believed, was the reason why a socialist revolution could never occur in Western Europe as Marx believed it would. Only a more peripheral, pre-capitalist society like Russia, for instance, could resist the continual advance of the West. The main distinction between these and the earlier theories is that they see imperialism as a natural consequence of capitalism, not as an aberration or failing, because they believe that capitalism is inherently bad. Again, take a moment to pause if you need to. This next category I've labelled political, but perhaps a better name for them would be decentralised. These more recent theories look for the causes of imperialism not in the centres of the empire, but on its frontiers. Robinson and Gallagher were the first to make this argument when studying the case of Africa. They saw a desire to secure existing possessions of frontiers, preemptive wars of self-defense, and the expansion of economic interests as being more essential to driving the expansion of empires than perhaps economic or political interests at the center. Fieldhouse looks at this sub-imperialism of independent, often rogue actors on the borders of empire, characters like you might have heard of Cecil Rhodes, who drove imperial expansion in Africa for mostly his own personal prestige and economic wealth. These peripheral factors interacted with the collapse of the pre-existing societies in the places they were expanding into. These collapses were often caused by the cultural and economic effects of interacting with Europeans. These models account for the reluctance of people at the center of empires to sort of actively expand, but whilst also at the same time actively expanding their empires. Their fierce desire to maintain empires once they had them was the result of actors at the peripheries driving imperial policy. Now, over the next couple of slides, I'm going to speak less and give you some time to consider some of these ideas we're discussing today. Again, feel free to pause the video if you find that easier. Perhaps you could even write these questions down and come back to them later in your day, just so long as you're actively working on each of these ideas. So, why might we find different historical theories convincing? Are we looking for a purely empirical theory? Are we judging it based solely on whether it agrees with fact? Are we instead looking to support ideas and positions we already hold? We like to inspire to impartiality, but to reach that goal, we often have to be open to the idea that the positions we already hold have bias. Is a historical theory more useful if it applies to more case studies and time periods, or is an excellent interpretation of one period and one event good enough for us? If some events contradict a theory, does that permanently undermine it? Unlike in the sciences, historical truth is often more than just correct predictions. So take a moment, think about those questions, pause if you have to, feel free to review what I've already said, and we'll move on. So now that we have those theories laid out, we can begin to apply them to some actual history. The next couple of slides are going to go over the individual territories of the Japanese Empire and discuss the events that led up to their conquest. Throughout each of these examples, do be thinking about which theories apply best and which ones aren't relevant. And the first one we're looking at is the island of Taiwan. Taiwan had something of a confusing history. Up to this point, it had held a Dutch imperial outpost, then it served as the home base for a Chinese pirate king called Koxinga in the 17th century. By the 19th, it was a formal territory of the Qing Empire in China, but their actual control of the island was weak. Japan's first attempt to conquer it came in 1874, when a punitive expedition aimed at punishing the native Taiwanese who had murdered Japanese sailors. This came hot on the heels of the Japanese consolidation of power over the Ryukyu Islands just north of Taiwan. The expedition was incredibly violent and resulted in the deaths of thousands, but accomplished very little. Villagers were given Japanese flags to fly, but there were no actual Japanese administration after this point. The Qing paid an indemnity to Japan to settle the dispute, but still reeling from Western attack, China was far too weak to really resist. Taiwan's formal annexation came in 1895, following Japan's victory in the Sino-Japanese War of the previous year. At this point, Japan's economy was not yet equal to Western nations. It had no real capital to export. This expansion had an awful lot to do with Taiwan's geographical position and the competition with China for influence over the countries between those two empires, less to do with economics, perhaps. The next important territory is Korea. In the case of Korea, discussion of whether or not to attack the territory had been going on since the start of the Restoration in 1864. This was even more fraught than Taiwan, as Korea was caught between three different empires, China, Russia, and Japan, who all wanted control. In 1876, a Japanese gunboat opened Korea in an almost mirror image of Perry's earlier expedition to Japan. This could be read as Japan learning from the behavior of other empires. In 1894, a war between China and Japan had ignited because both empires had become involved with suppressing a rebellion in Korea and were keen to shut each other's influence out of the peninsula. In 1905, Japan won a stunning victory over Russia, and Korea became a formal Japanese protectorate. In 1910, the peninsula was annexed entirely. Throughout this entire period, Korea was regarded both as a possible security risk and a possible agricultural colony. Any invasion of Japan, for instance, would have to cross through Korea across the straits, and both Russia and China were making moves against the kingdom. If either of them held the peninsula, that would be a huge security risk to the Japanese homeland. Additionally, Korea had a lot more arable land than Japan that is very mountainous, and it was hoped that that territory could be used to grow rice and provide land to Japanese farmers to ease population pressure. Next territory. With the outbreak of World War I, there was basically no reason for Japan not to join the Allies and seize German possessions in northern China and the South Pacific. Japan was forced by the other great powers to return some of the Chinese holdings, but it got to keep the South Pacific islands. These were relatively economically unimportant, but the idea of exploration in the South Seas had long exerted quite a strong cultural pull on the Japanese public, and these islands were beginning to be seen as important bases in a possible defense against the US Navy that dominated the Pacific. In a similar way to European societies, the South Pacific in Japan was being portrayed as a sort of tropical playground in the Japanese media, a place of exoticism and excitement, but also danger for Japanese explorers to conquer. But there was also the security aspect in terms of defense against the United States. So next, Manchuria is a term that refers to a huge expanse of land in northeastern China. This region had long been seen as having potential for natural resource extraction, and its wide open vistas and views were an exotic contrast to the comparatively cramped Japanese archipelago. The city of Dairen, just south of Manchuria, had been built by Russia but captured by Japan in 1905. It became a central link in trade routes with China, a hub for Japanese settlers drawn by the economic potential of investment in Manchuria. The South Manchuria Railway Company was founded to control and expand access to the region, and found itself in competition with local Chinese warlords for control over the possible railway networks. Naturally, this railway also had a military function. The ability to quickly transport troops from Korea to China through Manchuria would be essential in any hostilities against China. So in 1931, as militant expansionist nationalism began to rise in Japan, a group of army officers staged a false flag attack to justify invading the province. The army attacked without civilian government approval, and the government back in Japan was just forced to kind of go with it. The army stationed in Manchuria, the Kwantung Army, founded an independent state called Manchukuo, ostensibly founded to embody the vision of Asian ethnic harmony and headed by a former empire of China, Puyi. So hopefully throughout all of these examples you were thinking about how they might relate to the theories we discussed earlier. I want to continue now with a source examination. Take a moment to read through this extract. You'll have to pause the video and be thinking about what conclusions you can draw about the nature of Japanese imperialism from it. And as with any source, I haven't provided any information here, but be thinking about who the author might be and what might be motivating them to write. So pause for a couple of minutes and just read it. Okay, I'll go through some facts about the source just to make our examination easier now that you should have read it. This source was written by Hashimoto Kingoro. He was a colonel in the Japanese army and a particularly belligerent nationalist, having participated in multiple right-wing coup attempts against the civilian government. I've got some questions up on the slide here. Feel free to pause and move back and forth between these two slides if you need a reminder of what the text actually says. So Hashimoto's main arguments are political and economic. Japan needs space to expand due to its growing population. It is also attempting to resist the advances of Western nations who have, according to Hashimoto, hindered it, so there is an element of self-defense here. Notably, Hashimoto was writing in 1939, when all the expansion he mentions in the text and all the examples we'd just gone through had already taken place. These arguments are more about the reasons why Japan should defend and continue to expand rather than the reasons it might have expanded in the first place. We may want to say that Hashimoto represents a military viewpoint. Perhaps Schumpeter's idea of a warrior class applies here. However, similar arguments weren't just limited to the military and were common throughout Japanese society at the time. Similarly, there were some in the military who would have disagreed with the path of Japanese expansion. Even so, this source seems to reveal an imperialism that was militaristic and ostensibly self-defensive, rather than inspired by economics as a Marxist or economic theorist might argue. So to conclude, what is the best way to approach historical theory? When you write about your specific topics of study in essays or exams, perhaps consider some of these questions. Does a theory that's too general or too specific become less useful? Should a theory accommodate multiple case studies? How do we define our topic of study? And does it change the boundaries of what we have to explain? How do we keep our definitions consistent? Can we keep our own ideas and perspectives out of our work? Overall, have our attempts to explain the past through theory made history easier, or added excess baggage that makes the work harder? Just a few points here to summarize the entire presentation. Imperialism doesn't necessarily have one explanation, but many. The Japanese empire differs from European empires. Its causes were mostly geopolitical than economic. Historical theory is a useful tool, but we must always interrogate our assumptions. So thanks for watching. If you scroll down past the video once this video is finished, you'll find the resources that are listed here, which are great ways to expand your knowledge if you're interested. I hope you found this video interesting, and I hope you find the supporting handouts useful, and good luck with your future